let's go ahead and get to this this boycotts bill that I know you've been tracking really closely. In fact, Glenn, why don't you go ahead and set up what this bill was meant to do? Because it is unfortunately in line with some other legislation that has previously been passed into law. Seemed like it had a head of steam, co-sponsored by Mike Lawler and Josh Geitheimer. So you had bipartisan support. And yet it ended up being, at least for now, they pulled the vote and looks like AIPAC may take a rare L on this one.
Yeah, I think that, like, if I just give the brief historical context, I think it's so interesting and so important.
Yeah.
Which is, you know how there was this like whole industry of quote unquote anti-woke pundits or whatever who incessantly focused on college campuses. And you're like, why are you so worried about like college sophomores at Oberlin?
Yeah, I'm a little familiar with that.
Yeah. I think you've heard a little bit about that. Maybe you mentioned it a few times. One of the main reasons, if you look at most of those people whose careers were built on that, they're very strong Israel supporters. Israel identified like 10 or 15 years ago that one of the main threats to their ability to dominate and repress their neighbors is that there was a growing boycott movement centered on American campuses that they were afraid of because it was modeled after the one in South Africa in the 80s that was driven by campus activism and that took down the apartheid regime. And they set out to decide we have to put an end to this whole idea of advocating a boycott. They got the EU to criminalize advocacy of boycotts as anti-Semitic. They got that expanded definition of anti-Semitism. And now they're doing the same thing in the US. The thing that always amazes me, Krystal, is so few people know that in 37 American states, mostly red states, but not all, it is a requirement if you want to contract with the state that you have to sign a loyalty oath saying you do not support and have never participated in a boycott of Israel. You can boycott American states or other countries, just not Israel. And now that law was the basis for what Trump did in 2018, which is he said, it's now a felony if a company participates in a boycott sponsored by another country that the US government doesn't support. So let's say like Iran wants to boycott Israel and some company participates in that boycott, even though the US government isn't, that's a felony to do. And now this new bill would expand it to include not just led by or advocated by foreign governments, but also international organizations. And it would include people who are boycotting Israel out of conscience and conviction, and it would turn them into felons. And I think finally, this is almost like a bridge too far for a lot of people in the Senate, who, by the way, are also angry that the HRA definition prohibits anybody from saying that Jesus participated in the killing of Jews, even though the Bible kind of implies that in some ways.
Yeah.
So I think they're kind of going too far finally.
Interesting. Let's put C1 up on the screen. This is from DropSite, which did a fantastic job covering this. And actually, Ryan was saying the amount of social media traction they got from covering this bill was like extraordinary. So I think there likely was a massive effort, like a huge number of people probably called their congressman and were saying, do not vote for this bill, and on both sides of the aisle. So I think there might have been a public pushback here that was important too. You can see the Democratic co-sponsors. You got a handful of them here: Gottheimer, Moskowitz, Morell, Davis, and Gillen. You have a longer list here of Republican co-sponsors. I mean, and the primary sponsor is this guy, Mike Lawler. It's also interesting to me, this is a blatantly unconstitutional and extremist bill. And yet Lawler is seen as this quote unquote moderate. He's in a swing district in New York. I think he's very much in jeopardy for election this time around. He just got reelected. So he's been there a relatively short period of time. And it's the type of district that could easily flip in a wave election year. But in any case, I thought this thing was going to sail through. And now they've at least pulled the vote for today. I did not think it would get through the Senate because I didn't think they'd be able to garner enough Democrats to overcome a filibuster. But you did start to you had Marjorie Taylor Greene, who can put C2 up on the screen. She, I think, was the first person who came out and said, listen, I'm not going to vote for this. I'll be voting no. It is my job to defend Americans' rights to buy or boycott whomever they choose without the government harshly fining them or imprisoning them. But what I don't understand is why we are voting on a bill on behalf of other countries and not the president's executive orders that are for our country. You had Thomas Massie, who has been quite principled, when it comes to free speech. He came after Marjorie Taylor Greene and says, I agree. I'll be voting no on this bill as well. And you had Charlie Kirk, also chime in and weigh in on this debate with his commentary. There was one piece of this that kind of irritated me, but we'll see if you had the same reaction to it. He says, tomorrow the House will vote on H.R. 867, a bill that will criminalize private boycotts of Israel, fines up to $1 million and prison time up to 20 years. Bills like this only create more anti-Semitism. I think that's true, and play into growing narratives that Israel's running the U.S. government. Also true. In America, you're allowed to hold differing views. You're allowed to disagree and protest. We've allowed far too many people who hate America to move here from abroad, but the right to speak freely is the birthright of all Americans. That's the point, that part that annoyed me, because, of course, First Amendment free speech rights apply to everyone who's here. In any case, this bill should not pass. Any Republican that votes for this bill will expose themselves. We will be watching very closely. So I guess I am kind of curious what is going on here, because if you look at Marjorie Taylor Greene's record, if you look at Charlie Kirk's record, Thomas Massey I put in a little different category. Like, they're all on board with kidnapping students off the street for daring to publish an op-ed that was critical of Israel. It's not like they've been real consistent on the free speech part. Marjorie Taylor Greene sponsored a censure resolution against Rashida Tlaib for daring to participate in pro-Palestine protests and called those protests, insurrections. So it's not like she's been principled here. So where do you think that this is ultimately coming from?
It was so interesting when the Ukraine war happened. I had a lot of people in Congress who are MAGA affiliated or MAGA adjacent, and they were all against the Ukraine war. And I did it with RFK Jr. too once. I would have them come on and be like, why are you against the Ukraine war? And they would all say, it's enough is enough with funding the militaries and wars of foreign countries. We have so many problems with the United States. We can't afford to keep doing this. It's time to cut off all these wars that we're fighting that aren't in our interest and keep the money at home. And I would always say, oh, that's so persuasive. Does that apply to the financing and arming of Israel as well? And of course, they would start stuttering and trying to find reasons why somehow the rationale was different, when of course it so blatantly wasn't. I think what you're starting to see, and there was another Marjorie Taylor Greene tweet about Iran, very, vocally saying we cannot go to war with Iran. We are sick of fighting wars for other countries in the region that have huge nuclear arsenals, which obviously means Israel. We're sick of fighting wars for Israel. Krystal, if you look, and this struck me the other day, almost every day, literally, there's some major event that comes from Washington, like a policy initiative or an executive order or a resolution or a press conference or some big social media campaign from our politicians in Washington that are all about Israel. Like, it's every day they talk about Israel. Every day they want to do something for Israel. And I do think, like those free speech abuses, it's starting to create this backlash. Like, wait a minute, I thought our whole movement was about America first. Like, we're going to focus on the forgotten person and the working class and the downtrodden and the deindustrialized cities. And instead, we're spending all this time on Israel and attacking American civil liberties on behalf of this foreign country. And I do think it's starting to create some real resentment, not like in little spaces, but some growing resentment. Rand Paul gave a huge speech on the Senate floor about the attacks on free speech from this IHRA bill. And those are significant. Once that starts happening within a movement, many respected and influential voices within the movement saying the same thing, it can really spread quickly. And let's hope this does.
I think you were right to point to that provision that, Christians really took umbrage at, felt like that was constraining what they could say about their own faith. But I also think we have to be honest about the fact that there is a growing, like, overtly anti-Semitic part of the Republic. I'm thinking about Nick Fuentes. Very popular, overt Nazi ideology, right? And I wonder, I don't want to put that label on, like, Marjorie Taylor Greene or whatever. I don't know what's in her heart. But how do you feel about the fact that there is kind of a horseshoe with people who hold a view like Nick Fuentes and those of us who are trying to be principled about free speech and principled about, hey, let's not, like, endlessly bomb babies. This seems really bad. How do you intellectually grapple with that sort of thing?
I think this is true of almost every issue where people on the same side of the issue have sometimes differing motives or even radically antithetical motives. You could have people who are concerned about the influx of people illegally over the border because they're just white nationalists and don't want brown people in the country. And there are a lot of those. And you can have people with, like, good faith concerns. Like, people on the left used to worry about how it would drive down wages for the American worker, or how it would make cities incapable of absorbing them all in a humanistic way. And the fact that some people are on one side of the debate and who have really malicious ideas and others have well-intentioned ideas, I think you just have to separate them out, but it doesn't impugn the fact that there's this coalition itself. And, you could say that on the other side of that issue too, people who want open borders were big corporate interests. And now there's a lot of liberals who believe that are not open borders, but far less repressive and restrictive ones. So on the one hand, I get what you're saying. And this whole idea of America first, goes back to Charles Lindbergh and the isolationists for World War II, who thought we were getting involved in World War II because the Jews were kind of prompting us to do so. So that is the tradition out of which America first non-interventionism grows. But I also think these people do have because if they were only applying it to Israel, I would say, okay, this is probably driven by anti-Semitism. They're also against the U.S. involvement in Ukraine. They think that's just as much of a violation of the America First ideology, that it's globalism. Pretty much any military intervention around the world, that's how they see it. So yes, of course, there's lurking anti-Semitism like every other bigotry in every faction. I personally don't think that's the driving thrust of all of this. I think they're starting to it's becoming unsustainable to keep saying America first on the one hand and keep voting one bill after another, including attacks on the civil liberties of America about this one single foreign country.
I think it's becoming increasingly unsustainable with the base, I would say. And we've seen, look, Republicans are far more supportive I'm talking about base Republican voters, far more supportive of Israel than Democratic base. But Democrats have basically fully turned on Israel at this point. Some 80% or something say we should not be shipping weapons anymore. The real core demographic that still supports this view are basically boomer Republicans. But even among Republicans, there's been a shift in public sentiment. And I do think that there is power in, it's just so brazenly incompatible to say I'm America first, and yet I spend all my time thinking about, talking about, and passing legislation for the nation of Israel and hanging
or sending money to it,
or wear an IDF soldier uniform into the halls of Congress or whatever. It just, I think from a public perspective, it's very hard to sustain that position. And so I do think you see some representatives who are having to bend some to that reality. I'm just, on a whole, I'm just much more cynical about these people, just based on the track record. They're still all voting for more weapon shipments to Israel in lockstep. Like, there is no dissent on that whatsoever. They're all on board with, hey, let's just disappear any college student who participated in a protest we don't like. Let's just disappear and detain them and deport them and do whatever we can and attack the universities and the wokesters could never have dreamed of the authoritarian tactics being used to constrain speech at universities in defense of this one supposedly oppressed minority group, right? And so I just don't see anything approaching a consistent principle being applied here, which is why it's almost confusing to me that there was any dissent on this bill whatsoever, and I didn't expect it.
Yeah, just on that woke stuff, if you listen to Israel supporters and the way they argue, they have verbatim copied the script that they were kind of the caricature of the script of the woke left that they had spent years mocking.
Oh yeah,
there's this one minority victim group. Safe spaces. They had that 22-year-old college kid come from the University of Pennsylvania. I am not safe while I stood by Mike Johnson. Hate speech codes to protect this minority group, plus the instant resorting to calling everybody a racist and bigot the minute you disagree. This is all woke caricature of woke 101 that they've been mocking, that they now adopt completely. That said, you mentioned these polls, and there's clearly a very substantial decline, which we haven't seen in decades, in American support for Israel. And while, yes, a big part of that is due to almost uniform Democratic reversal on this, a big part of it as well are younger Republicans under the age of 50 who have had a massive jump. I think it's now a majority of people who say they disapprove of Israel is really just older Fox News watching Republicans who still have maintained their support for Israel. And if there's one thing politicians know, it's public opinion. So I'm sure they go to their town halls and are constantly asked about this. Of course, AIPAC is not going to disappear overnight. The Israeli lobby is not going to disappear overnight, nor is these decades-long dogmas about how we have to protect Israel. But I do think that these things happen gradually, through these incremental changes. And then also, I do think once people get desperate, like once Israel supporters really believe they're losing the debate, they resort to increasingly extreme tactics like censorship and other things in a desperate hope to win, and it fuels the backlash.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And so you have two key constituencies apparently supporting Israel in lockstep right now. That would be boomer Republicans watching Fox News.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.